Welcome to a very special episode of The Kicker. We're here at Jimmy's Corner, the iconic Times Square bar where generations of journalists have gathered for a little bit of gossip. And it's perfect because Jimmy's Corner is also a legendary boxing bar. And we are here not to talk about boxing, but to talk about sports. My guest today is Emma Baccellieri. She's a staff writer at Sports Illustrated, where she covers a whole range of things, but mostly women's basketball. And so because CJR recently came out with this issue about access in journalism, we want to talk about the exploding business of the WNBA and how that has changed how you cover it. So Emma, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First, can you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are? You didn't always cover sports. Like in college, you didn't cover sports, and you didn't always cover women's basketball. So I want to hear about the journey.
Yeah, that is true. I did not always cover this, and I did not always cover sports. I was someone who always really loved the idea of sports writing, but it was also one of those things where if you had asked me when I was like 20 in college, working for the student paper and doing news internships, would you want to be a staff writer for Sports Illustrated? It was like, yeah, in the same way I'd like to be an astronaut. Like, I know that's a job that exists, that a handful of people in the world can do, but why would one of them be me? And so I, went down the news path. Most of my internships were local news, some political news, that kind of thing.
And we should say that you went to a university somewhat famous for its sports.
Yeah, somewhat famous, I would say. I went to Duke, and I was on campus for a national championship when I was a junior. And so I thought I had this plan all worked out, that I was going to work in hard news, political news, something like that. But at the same time, I loved sports. I loved reading sports writing. I loved tweeting about sports because that was a big thing in the era I was coming up in college in the mid 2010s. And so I just was blogging about sports, tweeting at sports writers, all while I was doing these internships that didn't have anything to do with sports writing. And so I eventually got an opportunity to make that blogging more than just random after hours musings on my own. I worked for Deadspin doing nights and weekends, that kind of, breaking news coverage, riffing, just doing fun sports writing at Deadspin. And I did that for about a year and a half before I went to Sports Illustrated, where I've been ever since.
Mm-hmm. And even when you first went to Sports Illustrated, you were primarily covering baseball. You started your sports writing career as a baseball writer.
Yes.
So how did you make the pivot then to mostly covering women's sports?
I would like to say this was some grand strategy I had where I, really believed in the power of women's sports, and I knew it was going to blow up. And I thought like the best thing to do for me in my career would be to position myself there, before everything got super big. But it was mostly just, I really liked women's basketball. I've always enjoyed women's basketball. That wasn't an area where we had a dedicated beat writer over the early years of my time at SI. And I just kind of saw an opportunity that I loved baseball. I loved writing about baseball. I learned a lot doing it, but we had multiple baseball writers. We had, and still have Tom Verducci, I would say the best baseball writer alive. There are going to be fewer opportunities for a young writer coming up behind him, behind multiple other people. And so strategically, I kind of decided, okay, I enjoy doing this women's basketball coverage. This is a pretty wide open lane. I would like to do more and more of it. That started for me in like 2019, 2020. And after doing that kind of around my baseball work as much as I could, just picking up whatever story I could, pitching whatever I could, 2023, I was like, I would like this to be my full-time beat. I think there's demonstrated interest from readers, from advertisers, everything, that this is something we should be covering more. And, I've been doing this in my free time more or less for the last couple of years. I want to see if I can go big on it and see what can happen. And, I was lucky enough that my editors agreed.
So you didn't see this explosion coming when you first went in on women's basketball?
Not quite. I mean, I did think you could see, again, 2019, 2020, 2021, that the college game, you were starting to see some real change as we talk about like the beginning of that NIL generation. These players that kind of really owned their platforms and their brands on social media in a way that just wasn't possible in earlier generations. You could see that there was something different there. I think you saw college viewership especially starting to rise earlier. The 2020 bubble season for the WNBA, you saw some of that coming over to the professional side as well. You had more games on national television for the first time. But I thought it was growing. I didn't see it growing like this.
How did you go about getting sourced up? Because like you had written stories about women's sports before, you had followed women's basketball, but like you were pretty new to covering it as a, as a real beat.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I'm still trying to answer for myself even years in. The big thing for me was showing up and then writing about the sport itself, which sounds incredibly basic, but I think for women's sports as a whole, but women's basketball, I think in particular, for a really long time, you had this dynamic where the only time that national media, a place like Sports Illustrated, was coming in to cover a team, to profile an athlete, was to talk about what they meant for women's sports. Can women's basketball survive? Here's what it's like to travel commercial, with the Connecticut Sun as they're trying to get to their next game. Here's how few people are in this arena. Here's what it's like for them to have to, shower and change at a community rec center because they don't have their own locker rooms, which were important stories. And I think stories that certainly there was a place for them, but also at the same time, like these are athletes who are playing sports and they want to talk about the sports they play. They want to be covered for being athletes, not for being figureheads for, the feminist cause of women in sports and women in the workplace and everything that means. And I think it's a tricky thing where that doesn't mean not covering those other angles, because again, those are huge. I think you're talking about, these aren't just women when you're talking about the WNBA. This is a league with many queer athletes, a majority Black league. There are all kinds of dynamics to that player base and the causes that are important to them. But at the same time, you had people coming in to cover them as activists, as women, but not as athletes. And there's a lot that comes from just showing up to practice and talking about the pick and roll and talking about your spacing. Like they want to be treated as athletes. And, that goes for what the coaching staff wants to be able to talk about. There are stories to be told about the actual basketball they're playing. And so often those were the last stories that were ever told, basically. And so it sounds really simple of like, I showed up and asked basketball players about basketball. But really that was something that, you had many great writers, especially independent writers who had been out there doing that for a long time. But in terms of big national coverage, you didn't see as much of that.
Yeah. There was a moment during one of those, I guess it must have been 2020, the NCAA women's tournament, when I think it was Sedona Prince, like recorded this video showing like the disparity in their facilities versus the men's facilities. And I remember like getting a bunch of texts about it and people like blowing up about how unfair this was. And it was all happening when there were like some amazing games going on. And I was like, can you shut up about that right now? Like, I need to watch this game. And it felt like there was a lot of that where it was sort of like nobody quite knew what the story was. And there weren't very many people covering the basketball of it all. How did you like figure out like this is my lane in covering these sports?
Yeah, that actually is a really great jumping off point because that was the first NCAA tournament I covered from the bubble in San Antonio. And yes, that Sedona Prince video of the disparity in conditions was wild. My favorite aspect of that was that men's basketball players were given a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle to keep themselves busy during their initial 48-hour quarantine, and the women got a 100-piece puzzle. So, like, those cost the same. Like, this is just ridiculous. But yes, that NCAA tournament, like I said, that was the first one I got to cover in person. And that was great. That was the first Caitlin Clark-Paige Beckers matchup that you had in college. That was, you had a pretty crazy Stanford-Arizona championship game. Even being in that almost empty pandemic arena, I think they had opened up to, like, family could attend with tickets. And then they had a very small group of local tickets that were sold. I loved being in that arena for that. And it was a really tough needle to thread, I guess, because there were huge stories of how did the NCAA do this? What are the structural aspects of how the NCAA is organized? Like, for instance, at the time, the head of women's basketball at the NCAA reported to the head of men's basketball, whereas the head of men's basketball reports to the president of the NCAA. That's a natural difference. How is this television deal being sold? How are advertisements being sold? You have these big structural questions that needed to be covered because they were an important part of the story. They were what was driving conversation, like you said. People who had never paid attention to women's basketball before were the same thing, texting me saying, this is crazy, what's going on? And at the same time, that was a really fun tournament. That was the beginning kind of that generation of, again, that first Caitlin Clark, Paige Bueckers game in the Sweet 16. You were seeing a lot of the people who are going to define the sport over the next few years stepping into that tournament for the first time. I'm not sure I would say I came up with a great answer for how exactly to carve out my lane, but it was really just like, I want to cover these structural things. I want to ask these questions about why organizations are structured the way that they are to allow this to happen. But at the same time, I want to write about the basketball. I think the best way to do a service to the people who want to read about the sport, to the athletes who are playing the sport, to everyone who talks about growing the game, is to actually write about the game and to do both as much as I could.
Mm-hmm. So then when did you first start picking up on like, oh, this growth is coming to the W and this is exploding in like a really serious way?
It's, I think, probably a kind of cliche, obvious answer, but the 2023 national championship game where you had Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, you had Iowa taking down undefeated South Carolina in the Final Four. That was, the first two tournaments I'd covered. People would be like, where is it this year? Who's in it? What are the big players? And no one had to ask that year of random acquaintances who don't really follow sports, who didn't care about women's basketball. Everyone was watching that one that, it's like a little cheesy and sentimental, but that year I grabbed some confetti from the floor at the end of the night where I was like, I think this game was like a turning point. Like I want to save something from being on the floor as the confetti is falling at the end of this one. Like I think something might have changed here. And that indeed really came to feel like a turning point.
And then what about for the Pro League?
I think then watching, I was interested to see those players had one more year left of college. The W had always had kind of an issue with how are you transferring these college athletes with fairly big fan bases in some cases to the W. Why does that momentum fall off? How do you have that translate? And it seemed like this was going to be different just because I think of the players themselves. And I think also of these structural things, of these are players who had huge social media followings. These are players who were established not because, someone is a UConn fan, so they're going to root for anyone who plays for UConn. These were people who were like, I am a Caitlin Clark fan and I am watching women's basketball because of her. The same was true of Angel Reese. The same was true of Paige Bueckers a year behind. It seemed like it was going to be different, partially because of that just structural change of, them as like brands into themselves. The fact that NIL meant you saw these athletes in commercials, tons of commercials. That for a while there, it was like I felt like I couldn't turn the TV on without seeing Paige Bueckers.
I still feel that way.
Yeah. Great agent. It seemed like it was going to be different, that they really had come into college a little more established because of social media, and they were leaving it way more established, like as bigger than their schools, as bigger than their sport in terms of college basketball, in a way that seemed like it was going to transfer to the pros. And then you saw that starting to bubble up before they left for the W. I think that 2023 season, you saw just a more intense interest in like, how is the WNBA going to prepare? Who are the players people should know? You could tell that things were changing a little. You saw viewership increasing even in that 2023 year before those players came out of college in 2024. And then you really kind of saw it hit all at once, not just in terms of people who followed Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, but you saw it really kind of diffuse across the league in a lot of different ways.
So in those first couple of years of the change at the WNBA level, like, what were you seeing change in terms of the experience of covering it?
That's a really good question. The first 2 years, there weren't necessarily structural changes. There has been a change this third year, which we can get to in a second. But the structure was the same, but it was clear that this was like a level of interest from reporters that a lot of these teams hadn't had in a really long time, that the league itself hadn't had in quite a long time. The league, hired more PR people on the league level. They clearly were fielding more requests than ever. And it just really was a stark difference in terms of how many people are coming, not just to games, which always did have in most markets, a decent local media contingent, but people are now coming to shoot around. People are now asking questions that would never be asked before about like bigger social media narratives and kind of the place of women's basketball in the sporting landscape in just a way that you didn't always see when it was, a normal, quick shoot around media availability for a player about how's your ankle feeling for tonight, et cetera. Mm-hmm. You saw that starting to shift, just the having a bigger critical mass of reporters there, I think changes a lot of things. And I also should say, the WNBA had previously had open locker rooms, like most professional sports have had a history of doing, closed them during COVID, which all leagues did, but the W never reopened them. And that, I think, changes a lot of things in terms of how athletes relate to reporters and vice versa, when, you don't have an environment where you're kind of having just conversations rather than mediated interviews and press conferences for everything. And so I think as you saw more and more media coming in, everything is through the lens of a press conference. Everything is like a conversation mediated by a PR person. When there are only a few reporters covering a game, that can still feel like an environment where you're connecting with athletes to some extent, having conversation as people. When it's 10 reporters, 20 reporters, that's a really different dynamic. And so I think that's something we've seen the league grapple with, of how do you invite more access and get more coverage while having a dynamic where you don't have the open locker rooms that you have in the NBA. You don't have the kind of freer environment where you're having more of that give and take.
For folks who have never been in a professional locker room or any locker room before, can you talk a little more about like why that venue is important for reporters, and also like what the discussions have been around the fact that the WNBA never reopened them?
Yeah, I think this is something people have a lot of misconceptions about. And I think understandably that I think you hear locker room and you think immediately of players showering and changing, which this is a space for that. But generally, when you're talking about locker room interviews, there's a cooling off period. Players are supposed to have time to do whatever they want to do before the media comes in. There's a chance for the coaching staff, for members of the team staff to talk to the team before media comes in. And then in an ideal world, the way that a locker room conversation is supposed to work, a locker room media session, the idea is that you have all of the players there at once and anyone can talk or not talk as they please, right? So coming from baseball, one of my favorite things always was to talk to a backup catcher who has, knows everyone on the pitching staff super well, is watching the game really closely, but also usually isn't playing much. And he's not someone that a bunch of other reporters are going to talk to. That's the kind of thing that you can do in an open locker room, an open clubhouse in baseball's case, is to have those conversations that no one else is really having and kind of like carve out a lane for yourself. And also, you can ask anyone like, hey, I'd like to write about XYZ. Do you have a few minutes? And they can say no. Like athletes, of course, can say no. They don't have to answer anything they don't want to. They don't have to have these conversations. But you can walk up to them and you can ask and they can tell you no to your face, basically. When you don't have that, it's just a very different dynamic, right? It's if you are asking a PR person for every single request, they're going to make, one or two players available for a formal press conference, which is a setting that's kind of inherently adversarial. You have all of the reporters sitting on one side and the athletes on the other. You then can ask for other players to be made available, but you are usually specifying, here's why I would like to talk to them. You can't really do a casual of like, hey, I thought I saw you were like the way you were positioned on this play. I was kind of curious. Like a quick one-off question is not really something you can do because you are asking a PR staffer to go specifically get this player for you, bring them out. You need like a more full-fledged list of like, this is a full interview rather than here's something from this game I noticed. And this is one where, as a reporter, I always want more access. I'm always in favor of more access. I have rethought some of my ideas here around that space doesn't have to be the locker room, that I understand why players felt uncomfortable with some of the history of media coverage in the W, of the dynamics of a league of women with a reporting corps that at many times had been mostly men. That is a different dynamic than you had in MLB or the NFL. It's different. I don't think it has to be the locker room. And I think another thing that contributes to the WNBA, you still have a really wide disparity in the types of arenas and facilities that players are playing in. Like, an MLB clubhouse is huge and has lots of space for players to do whatever they're doing, to go be by the showers, to be by their locker. Some of these locker rooms are really small. You don't have that space. I think historically we've held up locker room access as necessary for access in sports media. I think there are ways to, experiment. If this is something the players aren't comfortable with, I don't think we're getting it back at this point. It's been, 6 years since the pandemic, since the COVID year. What can we do that provides a kind of access where you can have those conversations that are quick one-offs with reporters, where it doesn't have to be adversarial press conferences, where it doesn't have to be everything is clipped for social media, everything is positioned where, cameras are rolling on everything all the time, but you can still get the access that you need to do your jobs. Like maybe the answer is something more akin to a mixed zone that you have in soccer, where players will be passing through and media will be there, and, every player is going to have to pass through and they can talk or not talk as they please. Maybe the answer is a room that's not the locker room, that we see a lot of these teams moving into much nicer arenas that are either NBA arenas themselves or are equivalent. Maybe that's the answer. I don't think it has to be the locker room. I've had to rethink, as players have expressed, how uncomfortable they were with the old status quo. I thought I needed that access to do my job in the way I would like to do my job. Maybe this isn't the answer. But I think the current setup does leave something to be desired. And it does, frankly, it is dispiriting that a reporter who's covering an MLB game or an NBA game or an NHL game has a level of access that and has the ability to do deeper, more thorough coverage that someone covering the WNBA does not.
Yeah. You talking about the historical context here gives me a good opportunity to mention the fact that earlier this year you co-wrote a phenomenal book about the history of women's basketball called Court Queens. It's wonderful. I fully encourage anybody to pick it up. What else did sort of like delving into the history so deeply change about like sort of how you understand this moment of where we are in women's basketball?
The biggest thing for me was just how much history there was before 1970, before you think about the start of modern college basketball and before you have those first attempts at a professional league. That when we sat down to sketch out the chapter outline, we really were like, man, like we know it starts in like 1892. We knew it started around the same time that James Naismith was introducing basketball for the first time to men in Springfield, Massachusetts. But then what are we going to do from like 1892 to like 1972, that when you have Title IX? And we had ideas of like a few figures that we could pull, but we originally were really like, man, that is going to be a lot of decades to fill where maybe there's not going to be that much material. And it was a really pleasant surprise to feel that that wasn't the case at all. To see how much there was of, a lot of this wasn't necessarily organized basketball, but it was basketball. That we had some incredible photos that were so much fun to dig up of, company teams, of blacktop pickup games, some incredible games from World War II on army bases of women who were serving as nurses at the time, having their own games. There was just so much, and it looked different around the country. It looked different, rural versus urban. You had some places were playing 5-on-5 with women, some were playing 6-on-6 for a very long time, but you had a ton of basketball that you saw through all of those decades. And it was a really good reminder that, so often this story is told through pioneers and trailblazers and people just pushing to try to get the right to play, to try to be paid to play, then to be paid more to play. And there's also just a lot of really cool, fun basketball that existed that girls and women were always playing.
Mm-hmm. It also feels like it's been so easy for so many people to flatten women's basketball into one figure at a time, right? There was the Cheryl Swoops era. More recently, it's the Caitlin Clark era. And I wrote a women's basketball story a little over a year ago, mostly about the New York Liberty, who had won the title the year before. And they were okay, so everybody says Caitlin Clark started this wave of popularity. We were selling out games the year Caitlin Clark was still in college. So what do you think is behind that tendency to flatten everything into basically there's only allowed to be one women's superstar at once?
Yeah, I think it's just a tendency to gravitate towards the most convenient narrative, which Caitlin Clark has an enormous fan base and has brought a lot of eyeballs and money and all of that to the W. But like you said, this was already on the rise. There already were signs of how much this was changing. And I think it just kind of does a disservice to coverage to try to reduce it down that much. And we talked about that with the book for, the process of choosing a cover for a book is, I think, can always be a little fraught. And that's something that the writer, the photo editor don't always have a ton of input on. That happens entirely with the publisher. And we had some conversations where they had kind of had the same thoughts of, it's hard because this is a history, and they had thought about, could it be Caitlin Clark? Could it be Cheryl Miller? Could it be Lisa Leslie? One player, one picture as a portrait on the cover. And we were really excited that they decided not to choose one player. And ultimately the cover is just typographic because it was so hard to do a cover that would have just been one picture. Yeah. But I mean, it's I think a natural impulse to tell the story that people know, but I think as in anything, a lot more gratifying to find the stories that people don't know.
Mm-hmm. We should talk a little bit about the last off season because it was the second year of Unrivaled, the 3-on-3 league founded by players to get them some more money, so that many of them no longer had to play abroad. And there was this historic negotiation going on over the collective bargaining agreement. It was not at all clear that this season was going to happen. So what was covering the off season like this year, and what was it like trying to get information at a time when everybody was sort of desperate for information? Yeah,
it was very hectic. I also cover women's college ball, and so I had my attention split, which was not a fun winter in a lot of ways. This one was really interesting because certainly the W has had some contentious labor battles before that. The 2019 CBA negotiations were very big at the time. We had, this is going way back to before I covered the league or was anywhere near it, but in 2003, they came very close to a strike and David Stern threatened to shut the whole league down. It was only 6 years old at that point. That felt like a very real possibility that if they didn't get to an agreement, the whole, league might be in trouble. And so this wasn't the first contentious negotiation, but it certainly was the first negotiation, I thought, where it was playing out in public to such an extent where there was interest in this. People wanted to read about it. I think with most labor negotiations in sports, or really any highly public labor negotiation. You also saw this with Hollywood contract bargaining. There's a lot of negotiating done through the media. There's a lot of positioning from both sides trying to craft as much of that narrative in public as they can. And this was the first time I thought you were seeing it with the W, which was just interesting, just because I don't think that had happened before. That I think, the 2019 negotiation, even though it was very contentious at points, as any CBA can be, there were reporters covering it, but in a fairly perfunctory way. There certainly weren't reporters camping out outside the hotel where they were doing those conversations, which I was not one of them, but God bless them. Some of my, colleagues and coworkers and friends that I respect, that was a new twist, that there was such a interest in that information that you had reporters who were really trying to get it in a way that you just hadn't seen here before.
Mm-hmm. So then let's talk about what's changed this year, because it's a lot.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I don't think it's overstating it to say that this collective bargaining agreement that they came to changed the whole structure of the league. That under the CBA last year, the average salary was about $120,000. The minimum was like $66,000. There were all sorts of things that were not in the contract in terms of, medical and support staff, that some teams had really invested in that. You had mentioned the Liberty. They were one of the first under their new-ish owners, Joe and Clara Wusai, to really pour into these players and to treat their team like an asset rather than, the liability or an obligation. The Las Vegas Aces, kind of the same thing. Some of these teams were already doing what they could to give players a really professional experience, but several of them really were not. There was kind of, the bare minimum was really, really low up until last year. And with this negotiation, that's no longer the case. The growth in player salaries is huge. The fact that you can have $1 million players, the fact that, even as a rookie, you will come in making not just six figures, but comfortably six figures. That's a huge change. The fact that, for a long time, it was really tenuous for players who were drafted but weren't top draft picks because it was so competitive to make a roster. Teams didn't always carry the full 12 players because they didn't want to pay them all. And it was so tight to make a roster that lots of players who were drafted outside the top 4, top 5, even if you were a first round draft pick, you might not see a roster. That's changed now. Players have to be a 12-person roster. They have to fill all of those spots. They have developmental spots that they can give to young players as well. There's no G League like there is in the NBA where you have a developmental league where players can grow. And so having those developmental spots is huge for young players. And just so many little things of like having to have 2 physical therapists on staff. Like that might seem like a small thing, but having only one, which many teams did, was a legitimate struggle. Having to have a more robust medical staff, the fact that was something they negotiated, that's a real difference. So it's not just the money, although the money is huge, the revenue sharing aspect, which goes along with salaries. There is the opportunity for players to make a lot more money, which I think all of them certainly appreciate. There's also the opportunity for them to have a much more professional experience in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. It's still early season, but what has this new contract, the other changes, what does covering the league look like this year?
In some ways, it's, not that different. I think like the day-to-day mechanisms of covering a game are very similar to what they have been. They did make one change, which I find interesting on this question of access, in introducing tiered media, that they now divide reporters into tier 1 and tier 2, meaning a tier of people these are the beat reporters who are regularly covering teams. These are national reporters who are regularly covering the league, Sports Illustrated, ESPN, etc. People with a tier 1 credential have access to shoot around, to being on the court before a game, to doing kind of all of the access, even if that access is somewhat limited, having all of that. Tier 2 only have access to press conferences. And so that is interesting to me that they have clearly thought about, if we're going to make changes to access, what would that look like to give more access to some reporters and not others, which, is not uncommon in sports, that in baseball, someone who's a member of the Baseball Writers Association of America might have more opportunities in terms of access, in terms of where they can go on game day versus someone who's there on a daily credential, which is very, inside baseball, in the weeds of this. But it is, on this question of access, I think something that is kind of a big thing of, like, as the league grows up in some senses, it figures out what does it look like to have more coverage, to maybe set up systems to allow variations of coverage among the people who do have access, rather than just trying to get as much coverage as possible, no matter what it looks like.
Yes. And having more coverage is complicated. Just recently, we saw the Indiana Fever strip a press credential from one of their regular, presumably tier 1 reporters, because they didn't like how he had reported on a decision to keep Caitlin Clark out of a game. Can you talk a little bit about that situation and, like, how these fights are kind of happening in a different way than they might have before the league was so big?
Yeah, I guess I should say first that I think you are seeing this in some ways across sports, that as media has changed, as you don't have as many old-fashioned newspaper and local TV jobs as you used to, you've seen this relationship get more adversarial across sports, where you've seen, especially in college sports, you have lots of instances of a team, an athletic department, trying to control coverage more. You have a smaller group of reporters. In some cases, you don't have reporters traveling to cover teams on the road in the way that it used to be a full press box all the time for every major sport. That's no longer the case anymore. As that coverage has shifted, you've seen across sports, I think, leagues, individual teams getting pricklier about coverage and who's allowed to do what, and trying to control stories and trying to control reporters in ways that I don't think you saw even when I was starting out 10 years ago, and certainly not what you saw like 30 years ago, when reporters have stories of, staying in the same hotels that players were staying at, and like talking to coaches at the hotel bar, and just being able to go anywhere in a stadium at any time. Like, those days are long gone. And it is a weird transitional period, I would say, across, journalism, I think, in general, certainly, but sports in particular. You had this model built on daily newspapers, daily local television. As there is less of that, things have gotten weirder. But yeah, in the WNBA in particular, the league is growing and trying to court this coverage and trying to reach bigger audiences at a time when that industry-wide change is kind of happening. And so you are seeing something like what just happened with the Fever, where, yes, Scott Agnes has covered that team for a long time, has covered the Indiana Pacers as a local beat reporter for a very long time, the brother franchise in the NBA. And, pulling a credential is a pretty drastic move. I think this is one area where, in different sports, you have kind of different governing bodies that can push back against that. The Pro Basketball Writers Association doesn't have credentialing power in the same way like the Baseball Writers Association of America does. This is something they issued a strongly worded statement. There's only so much a statement can do. I'm really interested to see what happens over the coming days and weeks here. But yeah, I think it's a hard lesson for teams and leagues in general to learn of. If you want more coverage, it's obviously not always going to be positive coverage. That, more attention means more scrutiny. And I think there's a learning curve and growing pains in trying to surface all of that through.
Mm-hmm. And as the league gets bigger, there's also, like, narratives get created in a different way. One recent example I've been fascinated by of this is, like, every time I go on X and look at like WNBA X, like Caitlin Clark has fully become a heel this season in that space. That is not a narrative I am seeing in like professional WNBA media in the same way. USA Today wrote a column sort of contributing to this narrative, but that was way after it had like fully taken over X. So what is that shift like as a reporter, where you sort of like have to be aware of like all of these things, whether or not they're based in fact, right? Because they're just fans. So half of it's conspiracy theory and some of it's like who's a fan of who. I want to hear about what that's like as a reporter.
It's really strange because my general principle for, I mean, not just covering this, but like for life, is that I don't want to ever really bring up what I'm seeing on Twitter and make someone have to answer a question about it.
Good rule.
Yeah, it usually is, but it really has gotten tricky where, as you said, this really comes to dominate the fan discourse in a way where it can get very twisted and very strange and very unrooted in reality in ways that players and coaches then do have to answer for it. Like, out of all of those posts about what Caitlin Clark is doing this year and how the team has reacted to it, there were fan accounts making fake posts about Stephanie White being fired, their coach. Skip Bayless, the sports commentator, had seen one of those and thought it was real and was posting about Steph White being fired. And like, that is the kind of thing you have to then go ask the front office about. Like, can you confirm or deny that Stephanie White is being fired, which was like a obvious denial, and the kind of thing that it feels almost like, is it demeaning us both for me to ask this question, for you to have to answer it? But when this has spiraled out of control to the point where people are reporting this as if it's true, you then do have to ask the question. And it's strange. It's also, I think, the way that I looked at Twitter or X 5 years ago was different from the way I look at it now, that I think this used to be a somewhat interesting place to at least see how fans were talking about the sport, to get some ideas. I'm much warier of that now, given that I think, the incentives for posting have really been skewed with the way that the site has changed. It's a really odd time. There's a whole outrage economy that runs, really basically just on Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese posts, most of which have nothing to do with real life.
Yeah. I want to give everybody else a chance to ask a question, but I have one last one for you, which is a general question, which is, what do most people still get wrong about the WNBA?
Ooh. That's a good question. It actually has been refreshing that over the last 2 years, I feel like we've seen a shift where, partially I think because people have talked so much about frustrations with the NBA, that I see much less of like, they need to lower the rims, it's not fun if you can't dunk, of like, oh, actually like good solid fundamental basketball here is, great. I actually think that is something that for the longest time I would have said what people get wrong is the fact that it's not fun if you're not playing above the rim. I actually think now it's gone so far the other way around that I feel like I should say there actually are good fundamentals in the NBA too. Like, men actually can play basketball.
Men can play basketball?
Yeah, believe it or not, it's not illegal. They actually they do all right.
Let's make no, sorry, go next.
But no, just like the fact that it's a different brand of basketball that I think is a lot of fun and is interesting and is different. And I don't think you have to be like, ugh, and the NBA is just garbage and this is actually the gold standard. Like, men can play basketball too, is what I'm going to end on.
That's what most people get wrong about the WNBA. Yeah. I love it. All right, let's see what questions other folks have.
Okay. Thank you so much for the conversation. I have two brief access-related questions. One is, in the NBA, obviously, pre-social media and pre-podcast times, having in-depth interviews, having media events like the decision with LeBron in 2009 it was, those were the ways in which, the players could share the big moments. And now what you see is that every semi-talented former professional has a podcast, and even players who are still playing, and players can, active players can now just go and shoot the shit for hours and not really answer any questions, not really be held to account or analyzed in any way. that a journalist would do. And so one of my questions is, how has that impacted WNBA so far? Has there been a similar trend in terms of the podcast and creator economy, and I'm curious to hear how that affected your job as a reporter. The other thing in general, but it really fascinates me, is the whole Rossini-Vrabel thing and how that affects like questions about access in sports journalism right now. So these are two things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Both great questions. Thankfully, I would say the WNBA has not been quite as afflicted by such a plague of player podcasts as the NBA. But there are some there, and there are enough that, like, yes, I think it's something you see a lot in sports, but I think you see this with like celebrity profiles too, of like, it is really hard to make the pitch to someone of, I want to profile you, and here's why you should agree to this, which obviously you don't need that kind of agreement. But in order to do kind of a somewhat traditional profile of someone where you're actually getting time with them, they can go on a teammate's podcast. They can, in more conventional celebrity culture, you can go on Call Her Daddy or Joe Rogan, and you don't have to answer any difficult questions. And you get, frankly, a lot more coverage and airtime than you would with sitting for a magazine story. And so, it's hard to make the pitch of, here is why you should agree to be profiled. I think what I've found useful it really is an experience that's kind of like nothing else, that I think, a lot of people, including athletes, are still kind of intrigued by the idea of print. Like, anyone can sit for a podcast clip that gets shared on Instagram over and over and over again. Instagram is going to flatten everything. A magazine, something you can hold being on the cover of that, still actually does mean something to these people. It doesn't mean as much as I would like to think it does, but it does mean something. And that is kind of an experience that some people are still willing to say, like, okay, yes, I will maybe not make myself totally vulnerable and not give you days and days of my time, but maybe they'll give me 2 hours. Or maybe they'll give me 45 minutes. It's more like it. And then the other thing that, this isn't part of the pitch I get to make as often, but it's one that I really believe, is that, a good profile is going to show the subject things they might not know about themselves. It won't always be things that they agree with. But I think being profiled is just, there's nothing like that anymore, of getting to see a piece of work that positions you in the context of your sport, in the context of the world, that is not just about you, but about how you play your sport, how you relate to the people around you, what that means. It's a really interesting experience, and I think it's really valuable. And I think there are some athletes that get that. I think there are some celebrities, I would like to think, that get that and are willing to give a little in order to have that experience. Which is a little idealistic, but I would like to think that still carries some sway. And then, with the Vrabel-Rossini thing, it has been interesting to me how big that story got.
Can you explain briefly what happened for those who don't know?
Mike Vrabel, NFL coach, Diana Rossini, NFL reporter, most recently of The Athletic, which is owned by the New York Times, were photographed together in a somewhat amorous position, I guess I would say. And then other photographs surfaced that seemed to indicate they had been having some form of a relationship that seemed at least somewhat romantic over a period of years and years and several jobs for her, which I think certainly is frustrating as a woman in sports media. Of, that is like the most classic trope that exists, the idea that people are sleeping with or otherwise being somewhat romantically involved and holding hands in the hot tub in an Arizona resort, as they were with their sources. And it's one that I had never known to be true on any level. And it is frustrating to see here is a very public example of that actually being true. And this, kind of like old cheap Hollywood plotline actually coming to life in a way that is so public. I am happy to say it seems to be an isolated incident for me, and in the world of female sports reporters that I know many people who take great pains not to be seen doing anything remotely in the realm of potentially being construed as inappropriate, even when they're put in situations that require them like working to distance themselves from the appearance of impropriety in a way that can be frustrating, of knowing that, you know, a male reporter can text a source late at night or doesn't have to worry about what it means to see someone out and about in a way that a female reporter maybe thinks, I have to protect myself from the idea of being seen doing something potentially inappropriate. Yes, it's frustrating to see, but I do think it is fairly isolated, and then that's why it's blown up so much, because it's, I would like to think, one of a kind.
Thanks so much for doing this, Emma. This is great. I wanted to ask you about covering the W itself beyond like the players, but when you're talking about how different the style of play is and like how physical it is and all the issues with officiating that players have been talking about over the past couple of years, like how transparent is the league when those are the questions that you want to ask about, or, you know, when you're trying to get into those more kind of like structural issues? Because that always feels like it's going outside of that typical kind of like locker room setting, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really great specific example, because this is one area where I think the league saw criticism and understood you can't really hide from that, and actually did take steps to change it in a way that could be positive and to be somewhat open about it. Like, I can tell you that I had asked about officiating in past seasons, asked the league office for comment on certain things, and always kind of been, you know, brushed aside or given a very pat statement, and that was it. And this year I had questions about some of the changes they had made, and this year they actually made the head of referee development available for an interview, which was like actually very pleasant to be able to talk about these issues and ask these questions to the person who's actually making some of these decisions. So I think it's like a very good representative example that I don't think you certainly are not seeing that openness and transparency across the board with everything, but I think you are seeing a little more acknowledgement of the fact that with more coverage should come more transparency in some areas, that things will become a bigger story if you don't, you know, allow reporters to actually talk to people and get some of these questions. It will be harder for you as the league if you ignore this. That basically, I think for a long time, if the league ignored things, stories would actually kind of go away because there weren't that many reporters who were covering it. And now you not only have reporters who are covering it, you have this giant social media outrage machine that is really going to make it impossible to ignore some of these stories. And so I think you're seeing a little more give in a way that's been, you know, pleasing certainly as a reporter. And it does feel like a marked change from years past.
Emma, I could sit here and talk women's basketball with you all day, but we are keeping these good people from getting a beer at New York City's best dive bar. So we will end it there. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
The Kicker is a production of the Columbia Journalism Review. Amanda Dara is our producer, and we have a long list of people to thank today. Thank you so much to our wonderful crew, Mark Van Hare, Fernando Firmino, Alex Ham. Thank you to the CJR staff, Betsy Moraes, the editor-in-chief. Thank you to Adam Glenn, the owner of Jimmy's Corner, and everybody from Jimmy's Corner for making this happen. Thank you all for coming, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.